quiet gravedigger walked into the wrong bar. They saw his dirt-stained clothes and laughed. They saw his silence and called it weakness. But they never imagined the secret he held 6 feet under. The door of the Iron Hog Saloon groaned open, a sound of protest against the cold night air it let inside. For a moment, it cut through the thick atmosphere of stale beer, sweat-soaked leather, and the ghost of burnt whiskey. Heads turned, eyes narrowed in the dim, neon-red glow, but the interest died as quickly as it was born. The man who entered wasn't worth the effort. He wasn't one of them. He wore no club patches, no heavy silver rings, no chains that rattled with manufactured menace. His uniform was one of quiet utility, a faded canvas work jacket with the faintest stains of earth on the cuffs, jeans worn soft at the knees, and sturdy boots that looked like they'd walked 1,000 solemn miles. A simple beanie was pulled low, shadowing a face that seemed out of place, not because it was afraid, but because it was still. Too still for a place like this. This was Silas. He moved with an unhurried economy, his steps making almost no sound on the grimy floorboards. He approached the bar, ordered a single glass of bourbon, neat, and paid with a few crumpled bills. His gaze swept the room once, a slow, methodical scan that took in the snarling boar's head mounted on the wall, the scarred pool tables, and the pack of bikers who owned the center of the room like a pack of wolves around a kill. His eyes finally settled on a small, empty table in the far corner, a quiet island in a sea of noise. He took it. Not a word spoken, not a gesture of challenge. He simply sat, placing his drink on the table with a steady hand, and faced the grimy window, as if the darkness outside held more interest than the chaos within. But in the Iron Hog, silence was an accusation. 3 tables away, Rex, a man built like a bulldog with a neck as thick as a fence post, watched him. Tattoos of roaring engines and screaming skulls snaked up his arms. He was the son of the club's founder, the late, legendary, King, and he wore that legacy like a crown of thorns, always needing to prove he was worthy of it. He tapped his beer bottle twice on the table, a signal. The laughter around him subsided. Well, Rex's voice was a low growl, designed to carry. Look what the cat dragged in. He didn't look at Silas directly, but everyone knew who he was talking about. Somebody forget to wipe their boots after digging a ditch? A ripple of harsh laughter answered him. Silas didn't move. He didn't flinch. He simply raised his glass and took a slow, deliberate sip, his eyes still fixed on the window. That lack of reaction was a greater insult than any comeback. It was dismissal. And in Rex's world, being dismissed was the same as being spat on. The air grew colder. The laughter that followed Rex's taunt was sharp and intentional, a tool to isolate and intimidate. It was a language Silas understood, but one he refused to speak. He remained a statue of calm, his focus on the condensation trailing down his glass. This tranquility, this absolute refusal to be baited, was like a stone in Rex's shoe, a small, persistent irritant that was quickly becoming unbearable. Rex leaned back in his chair, making it creak under his weight. He projected his voice so the entire bar could be his audience. You see that, boys? Sits at our table, the king's old table, like he owns the place. Doesn't even have the decency to take his hat off indoors. One of his lieutenants, a lanky biker named Skinner, snorted. Probably thinks he's invisible. Looks like one of those guys who cleans up roadkill. Nah, another added, he's a groundskeeper. Probably got fired from the local golf course for being too damn slow. The group roared, the insults becoming more specific, more personal, unknowingly circling closer and closer to the truth. Through it all, Silas just sat. He took another slow sip of bourbon, his gaze steady on the window, as if the howling wind outside was singing a more interesting song than the men inside. His stillness wasn't passive, it was a wall. And Rex was used to breaking walls. He stood up, his heavy boots striking the floor with a rhythm of pure arrogance. He sauntered over, the crowd parting for him like he was royalty. He leaned his knuckles on Silas's table, invading his space, forcing a confrontation. "Hey. I'm talking to you, old man." Rex's voice was low, laced with threat. Finally, Silas turned his head. His eyes, when they met Rex's, were clear and calm, like deep water. His voice, when it came, was smooth and level, devoid of fear or anger. "I heard you," Silas said simply. "I just didn't think you were saying anything important." The sentence landed in the dead center of the room and exploded in silence. There was no raised voice, no curse, no challenge. It was a simple statement of fact, and it cut deeper than any insult Rex had ever hurled. The bikers behind Rex froze for a second, their smirks faltering, before they erupted in forced, louder laughter to cover the shock. "Oh, he's got jokes." Rex's grin was a tight, predatory slash. "A real funny guy. Thinks he's better than us." Silas raised his glass in a small, almost imperceptible toast. "No," he said, his voice still quiet. "Just quieter." For a heartbeat, Rex was paralyzed. Then, slowly, his manufactured smile melted away, replaced by something much colder, much uglier. Behind the bar, the owner nervously polished a glass, his eyes darting between the two men. He knew what was coming next. Everyone did. The man in the corner, the quiet man nobody knew, had just made his final mistake. Or so they thought. The atmosphere in the Iron Hog had curdled. The playful menace was gone, replaced by the sour tension that precedes real violence. Rex, feeling his authority questioned in front of his entire crew, needed to escalate. He couldn't be seen backing down from a man who fought with silence. He turned back to his table, slamming his beer down hard enough that foam sloshed over the sides. "He's got a mouth on him, huh?" Rex sneered, his eyes still locked on Silas. "Let's see how that quiet attitude holds up when he's dripping in ale." The others grunted their approval. One of them, a bald, bearded giant named Tank, grabbed a full pint of dark stout. He lumbered past Silas's table, executing a clumsy, deliberate stumble. The dark liquid splashed across the table in a wave, soaking the sleeve of Silas's canvas jacket, running down the sides of his bourbon glass, and dripping onto his lap in a dark, spreading stain. "Oh, whoops," Tank said, his voice a mockery of an apology. "My bad, pal. Hope your fancy little drink didn't mind sharing the spotlight." A flinch. An angry curse. A shove. That's what they expected. That's what the situation demanded. But Silas didn't give it to them. He didn't move for a long second. Then, with an unnerving slowness, he set his glass down. He pulled a single, clean napkin from the dispenser on the table. Methodically, he wiped the beer from his forearm, his movements precise and unhurried. He then used the same soaked napkin to pat the rim of the table dry, as if he were tending to a delicate instrument. There was no rush, no change in his breathing, no flicker of anger in his eyes. He simply cleaned the mess. Tank blinked, his bravado deflating into confusion. "Yo, what is with this guy?" he muttered, retreating to his table. "It ain't natural." Rex stood again, his patience completely gone. He strode forward, his bulk casting a long shadow over Silas's table. The background noise of the bar softened, then died completely. The regulars had seen this ritual before: insult, escalation, impact. But this time, the rhythm was wrong. The target wasn't reacting correctly. Silas remained seated, his left hand resting on the damp tabletop. The only thing that moved was his gaze, calm and steady, following Rex's every footstep. "You think you're above this, huh?" Rex loomed over him, a building on legs. "Above us?" Silas looked up, his tone still even, almost conversational. "No. I just think this place isn't as loud as it thinks it is." A thunderclap of silence. Rex's grin was strained, a mask of tension. Big words for a guy sitting in a puddle. Then, with no warning, he kicked the leg of Silas's chair. Hard. The chair rocked violently, bourbon sloshed onto the floor. Silas's hand shot out, catching the edge of the table to steady himself in one smooth, reflexive motion. His face didn't so much as twitch. Rex leaned in, his voice a venomous whisper. "You know what happens to guys like you? The ones who act like ghosts until they're stepped on." He grinned wider, his breath smelling of stale beer. "They disappear." Silas blinked once. "Is that a threat?" "No," Rex whispered back, the word full of cruel promise. "It's a tradition." Rex's eyes gleamed with triumph. He had him. He had finally broken through the man's infuriating calm, forced a physical reaction, and asserted his dominance. He expected fear now, or at least a desperate plea. He got neither. Instead, Silas slowly, deliberately, reached for his soiled canvas jacket. It wasn't a gesture of surrender, not a move to flee. He picked it up, held it for a moment, and then set it gently across his lap, covering the beer stain. "I won't stop you," Silas said, his voice a quiet murmur that seemed to absorb all the noise in the room. "But I wouldn't recommend what you're thinking of doing next." And that quiet, advisory tone, was the first thing that made Rex hesitate. His eyes twitched. He wasn't used to hesitation, especially not his own. For years, his size and his father's name had been his weapons. People backed down. People flinched. But this man just offered quiet advice, as if he were discussing the weather. It was unnerving. It was wrong. Rex looked around. The bar was watching. Not cheering, not laughing anymore. Just watching. Waiting. And that was worse. He felt his control slipping, and like any bully sensing a shift in power, he got louder, more aggressive, to compensate. "You got a death wish, is that it?" Rex snapped, stepping in closer. The toe of his boot knocked against the leg of Silas's chair again, harder this time. Still, the man didn't move. Rex's lip curled in a snarl. "Fine." He reached out, not for Silas, but for the jacket on his lap. He snatched it, the rough canvas scraping against Silas's jeans. He threw it to the floor, right in the puddle of spilled beer and bourbon. Then, with a final act of desecration, he ground his heavy boot onto the center of it, twisting his heel. "Let's see how zen you are now, tough guy," he spat. And that's when Silas finally stood up. He didn't leap to his feet. He rose smoothly, fluidly, like mist rising from a lake at dawn. He was taller than most had realized, his posture relaxed but perfectly straight. His hands were open at his sides. No fists. No fear. Just presence. For the first time, the crowd saw Rex falter. A visible hitch in his movement, a flicker of doubt in his eyes. He had expected a brawl, a clumsy, desperate fight he could easily win. He was not prepared for this quiet dignity. Silas didn't take a fighting stance. He didn't step forward. He just spoke, and his voice, though still quiet, carried a new weight. The weight of truth. "This isn't about me, is it, Rex?" Rex blinked. "What?" "This jacket," Silas said, gesturing to the soiled garment on the floor. "This table. This anger. You're not trying to prove anything to me." He paused, and his gaze drifted upward for a fraction of a second, toward the rafters, as if looking at a ghost only he could see. "You're trying to prove something to him. Because if one quiet man can ignore you, what happens when you realize he's ignoring you, too?" The silence that followed was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. Rex's hand, which had been clenched into a fist, dropped to his side. The name of his father, the king, hung unspoken in the air, a judge and jury to his son's pathetic display. The mention of his father, the unspoken accusation, was a direct hit to Rex's fragile ego. The blood drained from his face, replaced by a flush of pure, desperate rage. The psychological chess match was over. He had been outmaneuvered, exposed, and humiliated in front of his men. All that was left was brute force. "You don't get to say his name," Rex roared, his voice cracking. He lunged, not with skill or strategy, but with the wild, thoughtless fury of a cornered animal. His fist, a meaty hammer, swung through the air, aimed squarely at Silas's face. The bar held its breath. This was it. The inevitable, ugly conclusion. But the punch never landed. Silas didn't dodge. He didn't block. He simply spoke two words, clear and sharp, that cut through Rex's rage like a surgeon's scalpel. He was afraid. Rex's fist stopped, an inch from Silas's jaw. His arm trembled, suspended in the air by the sheer, shocking power of those words. The momentum of his lunge died, leaving him off balance and vulnerable. What did you say?" Rex stammered. Silas's eyes were filled not with aggression, but with a profound, almost sorrowful pity. "Your father." "The king," he said, his voice dropping to an intimate, confidential tone that only Rex could hear. "At the end. When it was just him, the earth, and the sky. He was afraid. And he was ashamed. Ashamed of all this." Silas made a small, subtle gesture that encompassed the bar, the bikers, the violence. Rex stared, his mind struggling to process the information. "You're lying. You didn't know him." "I didn't know the king," Silas corrected him gently. "I knew the man. The one who held my hand when the coughing got too bad. The one who told me his biggest regret was teaching his son that strength was about how loud you could shout, not about how well you could listen." The air crackled. The bikers exchanged confused, nervous glances. The bartender stood frozen, a glass held halfway to the shelf. "How?" Rex whispered, his voice broken. "How could you know that?" Silas reached slowly into the inner pocket of his ruined jacket, the one still on the floor. His movements were calm, non-threatening. Rex watched, mesmerized, as Silas's fingers emerged not with a weapon, but with a small, dull object. He held it out on his open palm. It was an old, worn silver dollar, its edges smoothed by time. On one side, barely visible in the dim light, was a crudely scratched initial, M. "He told me her name was Maria," Silas said softly. "Your mother. He carried this since the day she left. He wanted to give it to you himself, but he said you weren't ready. He asked me to hold on to it." Silas's gaze was unwavering, full of a quiet, unshakable truth. "He asked me to give it to you when you finally stopped trying to be the king, and started trying to be a man. He said I'd know the moment when it came." Silas gently closed his hand over the coin. "This isn't that moment." He then bent down, picked up his jacket from the floor, and shook the dirt from it with a single, sharp snap. He didn't look at Rex again. He simply turned and walked toward the door, leaving a silence in his wake that was deeper and more profound than any grave he had ever dug. Rex stood paralyzed in the center of the room, his fist still half raised, his face a mask of shock, grief, and utter humiliation. The silver dollar, the secret words, the image of his fearsome father being weak and afraid, it was a truth too heavy to bear. His tough guy facade, built over years of violence and intimidation, crumbled into dust. He let out a choked sob and sank to his knees, his head in his hands. The king was dead, and in that moment, the prince was broken. No one moved to help him. His crew, the men who had laughed at his jokes and backed his every play, now stared at him with a mixture of pity and fear. They hadn't just witnessed a bar fight, they had witnessed an exorcism. The ghost of the old king, the one they all tried to emulate, had been replaced by the ghost of a dying man's regret. Silas reached the door. He paused, his hand on the handle, and looked back, not at Rex, but at the bartender. "Get him a glass of water," Silas said, his voice carrying easily through the tomb-like silence. "Grief is a thirsty business." Then he was gone. The door swung shut, and the cold night air was once again sealed out. But the chill inside the iron hog was now permanent. For a long time, no one spoke. The only sound was Rex's quiet, ragged breathing. Finally, the bartender, as if waking from a trance, shakily poured a glass of water and walked it over, placing it on the floor beside the kneeling man. "Was that Skinner?" the lanky biker started to ask, but his voice trailed off. He didn't know what he was asking. Another biker, one who had been quiet all night, pulled out his phone. His thumbs fumbled on the screen. He was searching the local obituaries from a few months back. His eyes widened. He turned the phone around, showing the screen to the others. There was a small, grainy photo of a funeral procession at the local cemetery. And leading it, holding a shovel, was a man with a quiet, still face. The man who had just walked out. "Holy hell," the biker whispered. "He's the town gravedigger." The name hit the room like a shovelful of cold earth. The ditch digger. The groundskeeper. They had mocked him for being exactly what he was. And in doing so, they had desecrated the memory of the one man they revered above all others. The shame was a physical thing, thick and suffocating. They looked at the empty chair in the corner, at the puddle of beer on the floor, at the broken man who was supposed to be their leader. They had mistaken silence for weakness, and stillness for fear. They had learned, in the most brutal and humbling way possible, that the loudest man in the room is often the most fragile. The quietest man, the one who listens to the secrets of the earth, was the one who held all the power. Have you ever witnessed a moment where silence was more powerful than any threat? Share your story in the comments below, and please, always comment with respect. True strength doesn't need to shout. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing and sharing it with someone who needs to hear it.